The final winter of the war was not a season of snow and ice, but of iron and brine. By 1944, the North Atlantic had become an indiscriminate graveyard, a watery mausoleum where the pride of two continents lay twisted and silenced beneath the shifting currents. The Battle of the Atlantic, once a brutal contest of strategy and industrial might, had curdled into a relentless, grinding campaign of attrition. For the German Kriegsmarine, and specifically the men of the U-boat arm, the thrill of the happy time was a bitter, distant memory. Their sleek, black hunters were now the hunted, shadowed by radar, scourged by aircraft, and driven deep into the suffocating abyss by the lethal hedgehog and the unrelenting depth charge. It was in this brutalized theater, where every mission felt like a journey to the underworld, that the bizarre legend of the U-402 was forged. The hunter becomes a phantom. U-402 was a Type VIIC submarine, the workhorse of the German fleet. She was a weapon of elegant, lethal design, 220 feet of riveted steel, capable of diving to depths that crushed the resolve of lesser men, and armed with the devastating torpedoes that had nearly brought Britain to its knees. She was commanded by a succession of competent officers, and for a time, she had played her part in the wolf packs, sinking and damaging Allied tonnage. But by the time of her final patrol, U-402 was more than just a boat, she was a casket of desperate hope carrying 48 souls into the oceanic maelstrom. Her last port of call was Saint-Nazaire, on the Bay of Biscay coast of France, a monumental U-boat base protected by colossal, bomb-proof concrete pens. 6 weeks before the start of this chilling tale, she had slipped out of the pen's mouth, a black silhouette against the gray Atlantic dawn, bound for a patrol that the men aboard knew was highly unlikely to end with a triumphant return. The air in the control room was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and unspoken farewells. The war was lost, but the duty, the terrifying, isolating duty of the submariner, remained. The Bay of Biscay drifter. Then came the day, a single German submarine, alone, adrift in the Bay of Biscay. The aircraft that spotted her was a Luftwaffe coastal reconnaissance plane, likely an FW-200 Condor or a Junker. The pilot was flying a routine sweep, watching for Allied destroyers, when the black, cigar-shaped hull of a U-boat appeared in his sight line. Relief turned to immediate confusion. This was a German boat, close to the safe haven of the French coast. She should have been under power, vigilant, perhaps diving. Instead, she was drifting. The pilot dipped his wings, then circled. He dropped a signal flare, a common recognition gesture. No response. He radioed the boat's estimated position and began the procedure for identifying a friendly vessel. The identifying number was clearly visible through the binoculars, U-402. He tried the radio. Silence. He flew lower. He could see the conning tower, the turret of the submarine, and the bridge structure, but not a single man was on deck. No lookouts. No radio operator. No officer scanning the horizon. This was highly irregular. A U-boat, even on a steady course near friendly waters, always kept a watch. The pilot radioed the command station in Bordeaux, his voice tight with professional concern that quickly morphed into an unnerving curiosity. Why aren't they answering? The U-boat was moving. Not wildly, but steadily. Her wake was minimal, indicating a low, almost idling speed. Her bow cut a clean line in the water, a chilling testament to the rudder being held on a steady course. It was the perfect picture of a vessel on autopilot, continuing its silent, mechanical duty without a captain, without a crew. There were no visible distress signals, no flags, no flares. And critically, there was no damage. Her pressure hull looked intact. She hadn't been bombed, shelled, or rammed. The transmission from the Condor pilot crackled in the Bordeaux command room, announcing the return of the U-402. But the circumstances of her return were utterly unprecedented. The Kriegsmarine, a service that lived by iron discipline and rigid protocol, prepared for the worst. The approach of the salvage team. The nearest operational asset to the U-402's location was not a fighting ship, but a torpedo recovery and salvage team, a small, highly specialized escort vessel designed to retrieve expensive training ordnance. The crew of this vessel, led by a seasoned lieutenant with a lifetime of experience on the treacherous Atlantic, were briefed on a theory that was already stretching the limits of wartime logic. They were to board the U-boat. As their smaller vessel cut through the pre-dawn swell, the lieutenant and his hand-picked boarding party were gripped by a volatile mix of wariness and dread. This was the perfect scenario for a trap. Theory A. British sabotage. Perhaps an Allied commando team had somehow boarded the boat, killed the crew, and set an undetectable delayed explosive charge, a booby trap designed to kill the boarding party and further demoralize the Kriegsmarine. Theory B. Scuttling charges. Perhaps the crew had been forced to abandon ship, but before leaving, had set the boat's own self-destruct charges to blow as the salvage team approached. The vessel was a ghost, and every ghost ship carried a curse. They approached with excruciating caution, the rising sun barely touching the metallic gray hull of the drifting U-402. Every shadow seemed to conceal a hidden enemy, every noise of the metal on the sea felt like the click of a firing pin. Silence was their only answer. The unlocked conning tower. They managed to position their small boat alongside the U-402's massive hull. Ropes were tossed. The boarding party scaled the wet, barnacle-rough exterior, their boots finding purchase on the non-slip coating of the deck. They checked the boat's exterior first, searching for the unmistakable, jagged scars of battle. No strafing marks, no shell holes, no impact points from depth charges. The only wear was the honest toil of the sea. There were no signs of forced entry, no grappling hooks, no British capture marks, no firefight damage on the exterior. The first critical moment came at the conning tower. The lieutenant, pistol drawn, approached the main hatch, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the steel wheel lock. He expected it to be jammed, bolted shut, or perhaps, ominously, secured with a chain. Instead, the boarding party reported a finding that dissolved their military training and replaced it with an instinctive, primal fear. Every hatch was sealed, from the inside. A single, terrifying realization settled over them. No one had gotten in. The crew had left. The lieutenant ordered the main conning tower hatch to be opened. A wrench was applied to the locking wheel. A painful, metallic shriek echoed across the silent water as the seals were broken. As the heavy steel lid was lifted, the stench of stale air, oil, diesel fumes, and human habitation wafted out, the noxious but familiar perfume of a U-boat. And yet, when they opened the conning tower hatch, the submarine was empty. The interior of the impossible. What they found inside was not the devastation of a battle, nor the chaos of an emergency abandonment. It was a scene of chilling, domestic stillness. The submarine was preserved in a perfect, unnatural tableau of recent life abruptly ended. The boarding party descended the ladder into the narrow confines of the control room, their flashlights cutting cones through the diesel-hazed air. In the office's mess, the central table was set. Coffee mugs, enamel, chipped, still sat where they were placed. The liquid inside was long cold, a gray-brown sludge, but undisturbed. There was no spillage, no sign of a lurch or a sudden movement. The engine room provided the next macabre clue. The huge, complex diesel engines were not idling, they were simply off. The engine controls were set to a steady cruise, the levers for the depth rudder and hydroplanes were set for a slow, submerged transit, but the main power had been cut at some point, not by an explosion, but by a deliberate shutdown. In the cramped sleeping quarters, the clothes were folded neatly on bunks. Boots were placed side by side on the deck. Personal items, a photograph, a half-finished letter, a deck of cards, were all meticulously in place. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no violence. It was a perfect domestic snapshot, frozen at the precise moment before 48 men simply ceased to exist. The lieutenant moved to the tiny navigation and radio room. He found the most unsettling artifact of all. The logbooks ended mid-sentence. A clean, professional script, detailing the boat's position, the sea state, and a final, innocuous entry about a change in speed. The pen, having just formed the final, half-written syllable, lay beside the book. It was as if the radio operator, having just written the final word, had simply stood up and walked away. The mystery of the crew. The official report, when it was finally filed, would struggle to capture the profound psychological impact of the discovery. The boat had not been abandoned in panic. It had not been compromised by the enemy. It had not sunk and then miraculously refloated. It was as if the crew had simply stood up and walked out into the sea. The U-402 was secured, towed back to St. Nazaire, and subjected to a deep forensic examination by the Kriegsmarine's most secretive teams. The verdict of the technicians was even more baffling than the report of the boarding party. The U-boat was perfectly seaworthy. The pressure hull was fine. The ballast tanks were functional. The torpedo tubes were loaded and intact. There was enough fuel and provisions for the patrol to continue. The final, inexplicable truth was that U-402, the formidable Type VIIC Hunter, had been surrendered not to the enemy, not to the sea, but to an unseen, unheard, and unrecorded compulsion that had taken 48 men from their posts and led them into the cold Atlantic waters, leaving behind nothing but the perfect, haunting order of an empty steel coffin. The ghost of U-402 had returned, but her crew had sailed into a deeper, and far more terrifying, unknown. The recovery of the U-402 was, for the Kriegsmarine High Command, not a moment of relief, but the start of a deep, unsettling nightmare. The boat, towed ignominiously back into the massive, echoing bunker at St. Nazaire, was immediately sealed off. A team of hand-picked technical investigators, naval engineers, and intelligence officers, men accustomed to the stark, mechanical brutality of war, descended upon the vessel. Their mission was not to mourn, but to explain the impossible. They came seeking evidence of sabotage, enemy action, or gross negligence. What they found instead were contradictions that defied every rule of naval warfare and human behavior. The initial shock of the perfect, empty interior gave way to the meticulous, soul-crushing work of forensic reconstruction. The engineers worked for days in the narrow, oil-scented tube, treating the U-boat not as a warship, but as a sealed, floating crime scene. The riddle of the engines. The first, and perhaps most confusing, piece of the puzzle came from the engine room. The massive diesel engines, the lungs and heart of the submarine, were not running when the salvage team found the boat, but their operational logs told a story that fractured the perceived timeline. The investigators pieced together what little remained, based on fuel consumption, battery cycling records, and the remaining oil in the sumps. The sub's diesel engines had run for at least 10 days after the presumed disappearance of the crew. This single fact was a staggering impossibility. If the crew had abandoned ship, as the neatness of the interior suggested, why had the boat continued to operate? Who was commanding the massive machinery? The diesel cycle. The Type VIIC U-boat operated on a simple principle: diesel engines on the surface for speed and battery charging, electric motors submerged for silent running. The fact that the diesel engines had been running meant the boat had to have been surfaced, or at snorkel depth, for prolonged periods. This required a conscious decision by a man at the helm, a man who had to be in the engine room, observing gauges and regulating the motors. The battery paradox. Furthermore, the electrical logs showed the batteries were fully charged. This wasn't the signature of a boat crippled or abandoned in distress. A distressed boat would typically be found with drained batteries from frantic, deep-sea maneuvering. No, this meant the boat had surfaced intentionally, followed the necessary protocols, and charged its power reserves. The U-402 had been maintained. It had been cared for. But by whom? The conclusion was inescapable and chilling. The U-boat was still operational and under some form of guidance well over a week after its crew should have vanished. The abandonment wasn't a sudden, panic-driven event. It was a planned, or perhaps forced, exit that occurred after the boat had been made ready for a continued patrol. The horror in the forward torpedo room. The technical examination continued its methodical search. Every compartment, every locker, every pipe was checked for a clue. In the cramped, 6-torpedo forward torpedo room, the search party discovered a chilling and deeply personal detail. The heavy, steel-dogged hatch leading into the torpedo room was locked from the outside. This was highly irregular. The torpedo room was a vital, and frequently accessed, area of the boat. Locking it was a strict measure, usually reserved for times when the room was pressurized for tube firing, or when the entire boat was being secured for a maintenance period. The lieutenant overseeing the investigation ordered the hatch seals cut and the door forced. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. The torpedoes, cold, silent steel cylinders of destruction, lay in their tubes. But the deck was where the attention froze. The steel floor was covered in deep, raw scratches. Not the scuff marks of boots or the occasional dent from a dropped wrench. These were gashed striations, long, violent lines etched into the metal plating, concentrated near the lower edge of the hatch. The marks suggested immense, panicked effort. It was as if someone had been trapped inside and had tried desperately to claw their way out. The investigators ran their hands over the deep grooves. They appeared to have been made by metal objects, Perhaps tools, knives, or even the rough edges of belt buckles or boots scraping frantically. The implication of the lock. The room was locked from the outside. This meant that whatever crew member or members were trapped inside, they were locked in by someone else, someone still loose in the control room or midship. The implication of the scratches. Whatever happened on board hadn't been instantaneous. It had been a struggle. The final moments for a segment of the crew, perhaps the loading party, or a watch team, were spent in terrorized, claustrophobic isolation, fighting to escape an unseen threat in the rest of the boat. The cold, mechanical facts of the operational logs and the violent, emotional evidence of the scratches now created an intolerable paradox. The boat was maintained and then abandoned. The crew was professional yet panicked. The only consistent theme was the utter breakdown of command and the descent into chaos, a chaos that was now perfectly, unnervingly still. The German U-boat service operated on rigorous timetables. Every boat had a calculated return to base or rendezvous date. When the U-402 failed to make contact or appear at its scheduled refueling point 4 days after it should have returned, the watch officers began to mark it down as delayed. After 6 days, it moved to missing, presumed sunk. The sea was a voracious eater of schedules, and delayed transmissions were not uncommon. But then, the final, terrifying tremor from the depths rattled the radio masts in Berlin. The Naval Signal Intercept Station in Wilhelmshaven, a hub of stoic, professional wireless operators, picked up a signal that was utterly out of place, weak, and fractured by overwhelming static. It was an unauthorized broadcast, an emergency burst from a low-power, short-range set, the kind used for internal boat communication or a final, desperate distress call. The operator logged the time. The signal was confirmed to have originated from the U-402's standard frequency, 4 days after she should have reported in. It was a garbled, broken message, a fragment of human speech hurled across the vast, lonely void of the Atlantic. The operator, using a practiced ear and a decoding pad, scribbled down the words, his blood turning cold as he read them. The message was just 3 words, broken by static, an echo from a haunted steel tube. Whir horn, shrit. The transmission cut off abruptly. We hear the footsteps in the pressure hull. The signal was immediately flagged as Category Red and rushed up the chain of command, landing eventually on the desk of Admiral Karl Donitz, the head of the U-boat arm. Donitz, a man whose tenure was defined by unwavering resolve and a fierce loyalty to his men, studied the decoded fragment with rising bewilderment. Whir horn shrit. What did it mean? The words themselves were simple, yet their context within the pressure hull of a submerged, 48-man submarine was an immediate descent into terror. A U-boat was a machine of relentless, mechanical noise. The groan of the hull under pressure, the thump of the diesels, the whir of the gyrocompass, the hiss of the air pumps. Yet, submariners knew every sound their boat made. They knew the difference between the hull contracting and footsteps. Who was listening? The transmission was sent by the radio operator. He was listening. Where were the footsteps coming from? Who was walking? Every crew member was accounted for. There were no unauthorized personnel. Why the fear? The message was a cry of terror, not a tactical report. Footsteps are normal, unless they are unexplained, or unless they are coming from a place they shouldn't be, or unless they are the only sound in a place where there should be 48 men. The High Command debated the meaning, applying cold, military logic to the emotional spike of the 3 words. Sabotage. Could a British paratrooper or agent, hidden in the boat's provisions before it sailed, finally have emerged? The initial boarding found no evidence of a 49th person, but the idea of a highly trained, silent assassin moving through the boat explained the fear. Mutiny. Had a deep psychological breakdown caused a faction of the crew to turn on the officers? Perhaps the sounds were the mutineers, or the desperate remnants of the loyal crew, trying to secure the vessel. Psychological breakdown. The stresses of U-boat life were immense. The claustrophobia, the depth charge attacks, the certainty of death. Was the message the final, fevered delusion of a radio man driven mad by pressure, hearing sounds in the silence? But the most terrifying possibility was the one no one dared voice in the steel bunkers of Berlin, the chilling thought of something else moving in the darkness. Not a man, not a saboteur, but an unseen presence, a consequence of the crushing, supernatural environment of the deep ocean, an anomaly born in the darkness of a pressure hull hundreds of meters underwater. The sealing of the report. The final mystery was the ultimate fate of the transmission sender. Why did it cut off? Was the radio room breached? Was the operator pulled away? Or did the sound of the footsteps simply reach the door? The discovery of the empty U-400 2 days later, operating on its own, with its charged batteries, its neat bunks, and its scratched-up torpedo room, retroactively gave the footsteps a new and impossible dimension. It meant the struggle, the fear, and the final, successful operation of the vessel all happened after this last, desperate cry for help. Admiral Donitz, confronted with a reality that defied all military logic and threatened to shatter the already fragile morale of the U-boat arm, made a swift and ruthless decision. The report, detailing the empty boat, the continuous engine run, the locked torpedo room, and the final 3-word transmission, was sealed. U-402 was officially declared lost to enemy action, with all hands. The truth, too strange, too terrifying, and too destabilizing, was buried beneath the pragmatic lie of a casualty list. The hull of U-402 was stripped, her secrets absorbed into the concrete fortress of Saint Nazaire, and her story, the story of the footsteps and the vanished men, became nothing more than a whispered, chilling legend among the few who knew the full, impossible horror of the Ghost Patrol. In the aftermath of the U-402's impossible return, the High Command of the Kriegsmarine did what all military bureaucracies do when faced with an intolerable truth. They investigated, classified, and suppressed. The official conclusion of total personnel loss due to unknown operational failure was a clean, cold lie designed to be filed away in the deepest vault of the Navy's archives. It explained nothing but served the paramount function of protecting morale. To admit that one of their own formidable Type VIIC boats could be rendered perfectly empty, not by Allied bombs but by some internal, spectral force, was a vulnerability they could not afford. Yet, behind the concrete walls of the Saint Nazaire base and the Wilhelmshaven intelligence offices, a handful of trusted senior officers, the men who had seen the meticulous internal logs, the terrifying scratches, and the transcript of "were horn, shrid, were haunted." They gathered in smoky, low-lit rooms, trying to apply logic to an event that had shattered the known universe of naval operations. They began to circulate 5 forbidden explanations, theories that were deemed too dangerous, too demoralizing, or too absurd for official mention. Theory 1. The invisible killer carbon monoxide dioxide, the most immediate and practical theory focused on the submarine's air. Furthermore, if the crew had been forced to flee due to poisoning, they would have likely scrambled for the conning tower hatch in a panic, leaving a scene of disarray. Instead, they left neatly folded clothes, and the final act was one of orderly, sealed abandonment. The atmosphere had been noxious, yes, but no more so than a typical, long-duration patrol. Theory 2. The agent of chaos chemical, biological attack. Next, the investigators considered an internal weapon. Could a volatile chemical agent have been accidentally unleashed from a stored munition or an experimental component? German science was pioneering new, terrifying compounds, and a self-inflicted chemical catastrophe seemed plausible. The logic: a highly potent, fast-acting neurotoxin could cause the crew to hallucinate or panic, leading to a coordinated, yet irrational, self-abandonment. The refutation: teams specializing in chemical warfare detection were brought aboard the U-402. They scraped the bulkheads, tested the remaining water, and analyzed the air filters. No traces of any known, foreign chemical agent or biological weapon were found. If a chemical had been used, it had either vanished without a trace or was an unknown compound entirely, a possibility that only deepened the fear. Theory 3. The ghostly enemy British commando raid. The most militarily satisfying explanation was enemy action. The idea that the British Special Operations Executive (SOE) or a Royal Navy boarding party had managed the impossible, a silent, deep penetration operation while the U-boat was surfaced, was a terrifying possibility but one that had to be considered. The logic: a small, highly trained team boards the vessel in the darkness, quickly neutralizing the bridge watch, and then silently moving through the decks, eliminating the crew one by one, culminating in the trapped men in the torpedo room. They then secure the hatches from the inside and exit via the torpedo tubes or the conning tower, locking it from the inside with a special tool, before being retrieved by a shadow vessel. The refutation: the technical evidence was a stone wall against this theory. There was no evidence of intrusion. No scratches on the exterior hull from grappling hooks. No bullet holes. No hand-to-hand combat residue. Furthermore, the internal hatches were sealed from the inside, a mechanism that required a tremendous amount of time and effort to secure. A covert team would have left the hatches open for a swift, quiet exit. The boat's perfect order and the three-word radio message contradicted the brutal, messy reality of a commando raid. Theory 4. The shared delirium, mass hallucination. This theory ventured into the realm of the psychological. The environment of a U-boat was tailor-made for mental breakdown, isolation, constant fear, darkness, and recirculated air. Could the 48 men have succumbed to a mass hallucination? The logic. Perhaps a spoiled batch of rations, a fungal growth in the water tanks, or even a sudden spike in atmospheric toxins caused a shared psychotic episode. In their delirium, the men might have believed they were walking out onto land or transferring to a rescue ship, leading them to calmly exit the boat and seal the hatches behind them. The refutation. This was the hardest to disprove, resting entirely on conjecture. However, the rations were untouched and certified as safe. More importantly, the scratches in the torpedo room argued against a calm, shared delusion. The desperate, violent fight to escape implied that at least some members of the crew were lucid, terrified, and fighting for their lives against an external, though unknown, force, not a self-inflicted illusion. Theory 5. The voluntary exit, mass suicide. The darkest theory, mass suicide. The war was lost. The patrols were death sentences. Perhaps the crew, led by a desperate or nihilistic commander, had reached a collective psychological breaking point and decided to end their lives together. The logic, the orderly nature of the bunks, the charged batteries, and the secured hatches could all be seen as the final, meticulous acts of men preparing to meet their end with discipline. They set the boat on its course, made it safe for discovery, and then, together, stepped into the sea. The refutation. This theory was dismissed as impossible based on physics and simple human instinct. The Bay of Biscay water temperature in late winter would kill an unprotected human in minutes, a brutal, agonizing death. The discipline of the U-boat service was legendary, but it did not extend to such a chilling, pointless act of synchronized self-destruction. Furthermore, the locked hatches meant the men left one compartment at a time, sealing the door behind them, rather than all leaving through the main hatch in a single, desperate rush. And again, the terrified struggle in the torpedo room directly contradicted the idea of a voluntary, disciplined exit. The truth remained stubbornly intact. The U-402 was an unsolvable problem. Officially, the Kriegsmarine classified the event as total personnel loss due to unknown operational failure. Unofficially, among the weary, superstitious ranks of the U-boat sailors, the vessel was given a chilling new name, Die Geisterfahrt, the Ghost Voyage. The boat remained secured in the St. Nazaire bunker, a silent, locked-down curiosity for the duration of the conflict. The war's end, however, brought a new set of hands to the puzzle. In 1945, as Allied forces swept through the remnants of the German-occupied Atlantic Wall, the massive submarine pens of St. Nazaire were captured intact. The British Admiralty, keen to understand every nuance of the U-boat technology that had almost defeated them, took possession of the intact Type VIIC hull. The U-402, still bearing the strange, quiet patina of its final patrol, was hauled out and moved to a British naval yard for complete dismantling and study. The British examiners were seasoned professionals. They were interested in the engines, the torpedo systems, and the hydrophone arrays, not ghost stories. Yet, their examination added one final, terrifying twist to the U-402's legend, a mechanical impossibility that transcended wartime paranoia and settled deep into the realm of the truly inexplicable. The impossible clocks. The U-boat's intricate internal systems were powered by the electrical grid fed by the massive battery banks. The British engineers focused their attention on the chronometers and electrical cycle logs. These were not just simple clocks. They were complex, mechanical and electrical registers that timed everything from the air pressure seals to the depth rudder corrections. The Allies began the painstaking process of cross-referencing the boat's internal system timers with the last confirmed operational period from the German logs. And the numbers could not, match. The internal clocks, which ran based on the charged battery system found by the salvage team, showed that the U-402 had been under power and operational for nearly 20 days after the initial German investigation had taken place. The initial German investigation in late 1944 had already established the impossible. The boat ran for 10 days without a crew. Now, The British analysis pushed that timeline into the abyss. U-402 had continued running for nearly 20 days without any discernible crew intervention. A submarine, particularly a Type VIIC with its manual controls, was a machine that required constant human correction. Helm and rudder, the Atlantic swells and currents would constantly push the vessel off course. It required a man at the helm to monitor the gyro compass and make manual rudder corrections every few minutes to maintain a heading. Trim and ballast, changes in depth, temperature, and even the movement of fuel would alter the submarine's trim, its fore and aft balance. A crew was constantly pumping water between trim tanks to keep the boat level. Left unattended, a U-boat would quickly dive out of control or breach the surface erratically. Engine regulation. The electric motors or diesels required human input to regulate speed, RPM, and the charging cycle. Yet, U-402 had apparently navigated itself. It had maintained a course, surfaced to charge its batteries, and managed its trim with an uncanny, silent precision. The British engineers, men of steel and math, were left staring at the logs, unable to reconcile the readings with the laws of physics. They had assumed the Germans were simply wrong about the timing of the abandonment. But the German investigation was sound. The boat had been empty, secured, and yet, the clocks kept ticking on, logging operational duty. The finality of the unanswered question, the Allied report, classified under extremely unusual incidents, added the final layers to the legend of the U-402. The British, faced with the same haunting evidence, could only confirm the utter absence of a rational answer. No explanation was ever found. The boat's machinery was sound. The systems were functional. No bodies recovered. The men vanished utterly into the sea or the abyss. No distress signals other than the single, garbled fragment. The official communication channels were silent. No saboteur. The lack of intrusion was confirmed by the exhaustive Allied technical survey. Only the chilling, drifting hull remained, a machine that had refused to cease its patrol even after its human element had departed. The logbook, the original German log found by the initial salvage team, was now translated and analyzed by Allied intelligence. The final, unsettling entry, left unfinished by a hand that never returned, remained the only testament to the final moments of 48 souls. Only a drifting hull and a silent logbook ending with the unfinished line. Position 46 degrees, 12 minutes north, 05 degrees, 41 minutes west. Sea state 3. Visibility moderate. Course 310 degrees. Ordered slow ahead on motors. Whir horn.